Hello, welcome to Criticism in Isolation, an NBCC craft panel. I'm Heather Scott Partington. I'll be your tech host for this evening. And before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items I'd like to just let you know about. The first thing is, in order to find the closed captioning, please find the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen to view a live transcript. You can also view a live transcript on the right-hand side of your screen in the panel, if that's something that you would like to do. Take a moment to find the chat and let us know where you are logging in from tonight. Feel free to join the conversation at any point during tonight's event. We'll also have time for questions and answers. You can find the question and answer box also at the bottom of your screen. We ask that you use the Ask a Question box at any time when you have a question for our panelists, and we'll bring these questions to them at the end of our panel. I'll be monitoring the Ask a Question box as well as the chat, and I'll share relevant links in the chat during our discussion while our critics are having a wonderful conversation. Tonight's panelists will be discussing Margo Jefferson's Constructing a Nervous System. Our moderator this evening is NBCC board member and criticism committee chair, J. Howard Rosier. Justin's writing has appeared in Book Forum, Art in America, Four Columns, Poetry, Freeze, The Nation, and elsewhere. He is co-curator at Exhibit B, a bi-monthly text-based performance series, and he's a lecturer at the New Arts Journalism Department of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome, Justin, and welcome to our panelists.
Thank you, Heather, and double thank you to the panelists. I'm really excited about this, particularly to talk about this book in particular, which there are critical surveys and there are sort of straight memoirs, and this seems like a critical look at Margo Jefferson's influences, like the artists and figures who helped form her consciousness. The trouble with for reviewers, of course, is you sort of like how she carves up her psyche on the page. It seems like the challenge for the critic is to dissect and decide what's most important to focus on. Fortunately, I have four really fantastic writers who I'm a huge admirer of to talk through that. If you have questions for that portion of the evening, you should certainly reach out about that. Dan Kubis, who was a huge catalyst in organizing this, will be taking your questions and answers. Dan teaches English at the University of Pittsburgh. His writing and book reviews have appeared in the Boston Globe, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, among other places. Regarding our panelists, I am joined by Blair McClendon, who is a writer, editor, and filmmaker. His writing has appeared in N+1, Book Forum, the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, and elsewhere. And his film work spans documentary and fiction and has played at Sundance, Cannes, Toronto, and other festivals around the world. Like many other writers, he lives in New York City, though I feel like he's the only person here on the panel is from New York City. I'm also joined by Karen Sandstrom, who is a writer and illustrator living in Cleveland. She was a longtime writer and editor at The Plain Dealer, and for more than 25 years in newspapers. She left journalism to attend the Cleveland Institute of Art, where she earned a BFA in illustration. She currently works as a medical writer and editor for Cleveland Clinic, and she is a freelance writer and illustrator. Her book reviews have been published in the Washington Post. I'm also joined by Marion Winnick, who is professor at the University of Baltimore. She's the author of The Big Book and The Dead, and the winner of the 2019 Townsend Prize for Literature. Among her 10 other books are First Comes Love and Above Us Only Sky. Her award-winning Bohemian Rhapsody column appears monthly at the Baltimore Fishbowl, which is a great pub, by the way. And her essays have been published in the New York Times Magazine, The Sun, and elsewhere. She writes book reviews for People, Newsday, and the Washington Post, as well as Kirkus Reviews. She hosts the Weekly Reader podcast at WYPR, and she was a commentator at NPR for 15 years. And she has also received an NEA fellowship and creative nonfiction. Also a former autobiography chair of the National Book Critics Circle, so I'm very pleased to have her here tonight. Last but certainly not least, I'm joined by Walton Mayumba, who is a writer and critic. He is the author of The Shadow and the Act, Black Intellectual Practice, Jazz Improvisation, and Philosophical Pragmatism. His essays have appeared in The Atlantic, The Believer, The Boston Globe, Los Angeles Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, and Oxford American, among other outlets. Mayumba holds the Susan Dew Goober Chair of Literature at Indiana University at Bloomington. Thank you all for being here. I'm like really excited. I was rereading Jefferson's book over the weekend and reading all your reviews, and I was going through them. I was struck by where everybody landed on the question of it's a memoir that's also the sort of critical assessment and where people landed. The first thing that came to mind was a piece from Blair's review, which appeared in Book Forum, this question at the end of his review, which is when Black becomes a proper noun, who capitalizes? I thought about that very often when I was going through Blair's review, which does many things, but ultimately rests on contextualizing Jefferson's relationship to her influences as a critique of bourgeois Black society. I hope I'm reading that right. And it's posited specifically with reference to Negroland, Jefferson's previous work. So the question I have to start the conversation with Blair is, when you were sketching the review out, did you always conceive of these works in conversation, or that come about later as you were drafting?
It came about later. I mean, I was taking notes throughout while reading the book since I knew I was reviewing it. But it's sort of the section that's towards the end about that phrase borrowed, stolen, I think is like what made me understand what I had to say about it. Because I was just really struck by the honesty of that line, to say that like sort of the bourgeois Black people had in fact borrowed and stolen a certain style and like mode of being from working class Black people, which is just like not how that discussion normally goes. It normally goes amongst like broader ideas of cultural appropriation. And it just stops me dead as like a thing you don't hear people say, you know, in public very often, maybe perhaps less publicly. And at that line was sort of when I went back and was like, okay, yeah, I guess I do have to go back and talk more about Negroland, because, you know, I could be wrong about it, but I do think that like something Negroland does relative to this book is I think it kind of frees this book up to play looser with biography and with memoir. Because you are like, if you've read both of them, and I like reread Negroland after reading this, she is going back over again and again a few of the same instances or same stories that are there, but she treats them much more lightly here. And it feels to me very much like it's difficult to talk about one without the other, because I think it's sort of given her permission to be a little lighter in this one, and then use those instances as ways to connect to sort of a broader criticism, even if they are sort of still filtered through her sensibility and her sort of coming into herself.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, like thematically, there's a lot there, and the idea of one freeing up the other formally, that's like really, that's great. I did want to open that up to the floor though, and ask a very basic question about reviewing that, which is, how much of a previous author's work do you factor in when you're reviewing generally? Do you focus on that a lot, or like not at all? Or I think that's a really interesting question, especially for like critics coming up.
I can answer and say that a lot of times that I will read backlists that I haven't read, you know, just to feel like I'm on the, you know, that I know what's going on with this writer. But for this review, I actually was more interested in reading past reviews. So I read reviews of Negroland and Michael Jackson, and because I wanted to know if, you know, it was important to me to understand what the previous critical reaction had been to the books before it.
That's really interesting. Did anyone else have a similar response, like reading more reviews versus reading like previous works? Because Jefferson was a critic she's been a critic for a very long time. Like a really illustrious career as a critic, Pulitzer Prize winner, former NBCC winner.
I did. I went back to reread parts of Negroland and on Michael Jackson, because I wanted to think about, and it comes up a little bit in my review. Think about why another memoir, which is a question that actually Blair asked in his conversation with Jefferson, and because I'm kind of interested in the book business a little bit, I just kind of invented this narrative in my head where they, here's a writer of stature of a particular age, maybe some kind of collected or selected essays ought to come out. But I'm sure someone said, well, that will never sell. Another memoir will sell. And so what we get is this kind of hybrid work where there's criticism and memoir simultaneously. But my impression is that she's actually been doing that kind of hybrid work all along. And that, as Blair just mentioned, she's freer with it because she's established, I think, some blocks for her readers to like step on to get to this work, which is kind of how I received it. And I didn't necessarily go back to reviews of the previous books. I went back to Jefferson's reviews and went back actually all the way back to the 70s. I guess this is one of the luxuries of being attached to an academic institution. The library has all that stuff. So you can go through the files and find, I think there's a really interesting kind of intellectual consistency in her work. And so that's also, I think, a kind of thread I was trying to pull through my reaction to the book.
Could I follow up on that? And because I this thing you wrote, I think it might have also been one of your last lines as well, Walton. The Black critic always enacts her interiority, self-assembly, and education publicly. Is that what made you think of that? Just reading this sort of Jefferson's work in aggregate?
Yeah, I mean, if I expand that, if I were to expand that piece, it would become my own kind of hybrid work. Because, and I do write about this in the piece, that Jefferson's a key figure in my development as a critic and writer. That when I was in graduate school, trying to figure out, what my topics were going to be, and how I wanted to write, I was reading Jefferson weekly. I think she had a column at one point, and I started buying the daily New York Times on Tuesdays or something so that I could read her column specifically, because I was being educated in American studies in some ways, but through her work. So she's not only exercising her Black intellectual development publicly, I am too. So by the time I come to write about her, it's almost an expression of my own kind of development.
Yeah, I noticed that parallel, like you're talking about your development in a book in which she's talking about her development. I thought it was cool. Another line that you brought up that I also thought was like really fascinating. There's a not reticence. I think the word used like capriciousness, and there's a line in Construction Nervous System. I suspect in the worst capriciousness, the author expressing misfeelings about writing another autobiographical, which I think you kind of answered that like previously in terms of thinking that maybe that might be like a marketing consideration versus like the author's true desires. I thought that was really interesting as well. The sort of the need to keep a lid on things for like manners in a book that's normally like unmannered. Like it's a very unmannered book, but that's still that still kind of remains. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there are always several things happening with Black writers trying to expose themselves or not expose themselves. That and I think this also has to do with being a writer of her generation. It's fascinating that the book is not, and Marion kind of gets at this a little bit, like she's not really forthcoming with the most interesting stuff. Like, I want to know about the affair. In other memoirs, you're getting a lot of sex. There's not a lot of sex here, right? There is a lot of interiority, but it's also, and I think she's actually showing her hand throughout that she wants to present herself, but is resisting that. There's something risky about putting herself on the line in that full-blown way. And I'm struck that it goes back to, it's simply part of the Black writing tradition in this country that you can't actually put all the dirty laundry out.
Interesting.
So I that's just how I'm, reading this particular writer who has used criticism as a kind of shield and cloak. And even when she claims to be trying to do this other form of writing, where she's displaying her psychological self through these kind of performances, there's still a kind of cloaking. It's revealing and not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought about Marion's review a lot too in relation to yours, because Marion had you'd mentioned that quote from the book, "Remember memoir as your present, negotiating with your past for a future you're willing to show up in." And so it's like a more of an intellectual past versus her life experience, is how she made that choice, and you thought that might not, I don't want to speak for you, it seemed like you thought that might have not been or you thought it was an interesting choice to prioritize like that stuff versus the personal stuff. Am I reading you right, Marion, or am I like? Sorry, I think you're on mute. Sorry, Marion, I think you're on mute.
What I said is actually I was frustrated by it more than think it's an interesting choice. I wanted to know about, I thought it was to bring up the fact of her sister's death, and then also to bring up her mother's silence about it, but then to just stop right there and not tell us anymore. This is why I was looking at other, at the criticism of some of her past work, because I felt like, so am I just like having a lowbrow reaction here, where I just want more juice. I want more, or am I not the only person that has ever felt this way? So I guess someone asked in the chat, like, why would I do this? And I guess, I felt anxious about lodging this criticism or expressing this frustration with the book, and wanted to know. And when I started reading other reviews, I saw that in reactions to previous books, the same thing had been brought up. So, this is not something that just started here. This certain amount of withholding on personal stories has been a theme. And, it might be what Walton said, that that's a tradition for Black writers, and unfortunate, because you don't want to, because of airing dirty laundry. But I don't see it as dirty laundry. And so, yeah, I felt that like I wasn't satisfied by what I found out. I wanted to find out more. And I was anxious to say that. So I tried to see if anyone else was saying that too.
Yeah, I think I felt your frustration. I just didn't want to like speak for you and like assume that that was like how you felt. I would like to raise a question to the group based on that though, because I do think it's like a question of expectation. Like, how much personal information do people expect from a memoir, like a nonfiction work that's, in this like personal or first person? I thought about a lot of recent books. I thought about like Trick Mirror, Minor Feelings, The Unfinished by Vivian Gornick books. It seems like that's the choice, like people are trying to decide like how much of their personhood they're trying to put in the book versus how much they're trying to apply a critical lens. Jefferson seems unique for whatever that's worth to me, that I don't think she does personally choose. But I'm just curious as to how people, what people's expectations are for like a memoir.
My expectations for memoir are one thing. And I think pretty early on with this book, and I mean, I usually want those facts. I usually want, as kind of what Miriam was describing. Pretty early with this book, though, it becomes evident that Jefferson isn't doing the usual memoir thing. And pretty early, I started to accept that. I started looking at those elliptical spaces as sort of negative space, like she does address this whole question of leaving things out because of what's been talked about, because of this reticence about airing laundry. But I also thought it also felt like a formal thing, that a choice where she was dropping things in so intentionally, the biographical stuff, and weaving it with the cultural criticism so well that I just stopped caring. I did want to know more about her sister. I wanted to know those things, but I stopped being attached to that pretty early on, in a way that I don't think I would have overlooked in a more traditional memoir.
I think I guess with the caveat that I also love to allude to things and then keep moving and not explain what I was talking about personally. So maybe I'm just on her side for that reason. I guess sort of my impression of where those ellipses come, I think were about like which places she was choosing to be honest and which kinds of things she was choosing to be honest about, which might just be my reaction to sort of like, a decade of young writers learning to write personal essays where they were extremely honest about themselves, in a way that like maybe of a prior generation, somebody would tell you slow down for a second. But at the same time, I think we're like often less intellectually honest in their criticism of the culture they were talking about than she is here. And so to me, it's like what I was shocked by was like the you know, I mean, the honesty about like wanting to be Bing Crosby. I was like, I don't really know how many people would say it. And like that Ike Turner passage really stunned me, just because I was like, nobody would say that right now. They would not admit to the fact that it's Ike they were after, and that in fact something of Ike's danger was what she was after. So I guess what I sort of felt like is I was like, you're withholding certain personal things that I think in the memoir and maybe just like in contemporary literature have become more expected, but you're also sort of avoiding the like literature as pep rally thing that I think has also become kind of expected. Which, you know, perhaps somebody down the line will just do both at the same
What do you
time.
mean? What do you mean by literature as pep rally?
As in that I think like she is critical of the culture that she is like cultures that she is talking about in a way that just like one does not really see quite frequently right now, and is recursive about it, and is like questioning herself in a way that I think there are certain imperatives to like land more cleanly on. Yeah, I mean, and the easiest way to discuss it, I think, is through the Ike section, which is just like one, the sort of admission in the course of that, of this whole history of like class and gender separation within that community. The other is to like, because she's capable of doing it recursively, in that to be like, I recognize at the beginning that Ike is not the person I should be lauding right now, and yet to still insist upon, but there was power there, and that is in fact what we were after. Rather than I think what might have been easier, which is to write a piece that's just sort of a straight up celebration of like, look how cool all of this Black culture is. And this, I think, gets like naughtier and like is less, it's less slick, it's less easily digestible. And I think for that reason, slightly more honest, though then I think she's pairing that, like you guys are saying, with like holding more about herself back.
Even in terms of the Willa Cather section, like that felt extremely uncomfortable. Not that, you know, she was focusing on Willa Cather, but just the idea that she didn't want these white women in her class to see her as the person who is offended by Willa Cather. So what do you do with that? Yeah, it was like very uncomfortable, but very honest. I don't think many people would like go for that, but it just felt like Margo Jefferson was just putting everything on the table. But it's also not at the expense, or it's at the expense of herself. It's not like a, you know, a distant view. You know, she's very much putting her own like consciousness on the table. So I would agree with that in many ways. I did have another question I wanted to ask the group with reference to Karen's review. There was a line where you described the book as offering the reader an opportunity to become comfortable with the discomfort of life's contradictions. That made me think very deeply about the form of the book, which is kind of freewheeling. I guess how much of an obligation do you all feel to describe the reading experience for people encountering your reviews? This book in particular, I think the stakes of that are very high, like to describe what it's like to read this, because it is so formally busy.
I felt, I would say, quite obligated to do my best at it. It's funny, I spoke to people who, you know, good readers, avid readers who read widely after my piece came out, and who got the book to read it and then said like, I didn't get it, I had to put it down, you know. And I think we have like a really basic obligation to give people an idea of what they're in for formally. Like if you went at, you know, Lincoln in the Bardo without knowing what George Saunders was up to, there were people who would just like, you know, throw it out the window. In this case, you know, I actually loved what she was doing right away. I didn't feel that way about Saunders, but I got there. But I do feel like you want to tell people when they're facing something unusual. But yes, stick with it and groove with it, because it's like, it's worth it. And I think that's like the very basic kind of, I don't want to say like consumer level, the low part of book reviewing, where you're telling people as consumers of books who are going to spend time, their most limited resource, that this is at least different. I think it's super hard. I thought it was very hard to give people an idea of what the reading experience is like beyond just, it's more like dancing. It's more like, it's more like a lot of things, than it is like a reading a traditional memoir. So that was my take.
I mean, I really centered that in my review. I opened with, this is like you're at an in conversation event and it's Margo Jefferson in conversation with Margo Jefferson, poking and prodding herself. I actually think that that's the main thing I accomplished in my review, was to explain what the book is like, to read. And I'm a heavy quoter. And I quoted quite a bit of these things where she's yelling at herself and ordering herself to do this and that. That was such a powerful part of the reading experience for me. And, the thing I wanted to tell people most.
I can't remember what I did with that in the review, although my inclination is to think that I tried to mirror the form of the book at some level in the piece, that maybe that's what the end is about. I think it's hard to, I did quote a lot, also, especially those parts where I'm using Jefferson's language to describe what she's trying to merge. And hopefully in that description, in her language, it becomes a kind of shorthand for the rest of the, for what's happening in the rest of the book. Yeah, I think that's what I tried to do, was just like, how can I make the review itself do some of the work that the book is doing? So when I flip in the end to talk about, even that last piece about Jefferson's, I think I cite her review of the Stud Circle book. That was a way of putting her in conversation with herself, as Marion has put it.
Yeah, I guess I feel like, I don't know, I think like daring writers kind of dare you to follow them. And so I think I did sort of a similar thing that you were just describing. Is I was like, oh, this book does is free you up. I think like what's really interesting about it as a reading experience is that I think like most of these kinds of things are trying to stage the drama of an argument, and this feels more to me like she's staging the drama of thought. And so that's not like always going to land quite cleanly, and will double back on itself. And so I guess like approaching that, I was like, oh, what this actually allows me to do is sort of some of that doubling back and finding the places that doesn't actually quite stick as cleanly as you want, which I guess I did most clearly when I found an excuse to talk about 50 Cent. But that it's like, yeah, this does land in a certain clean thought that I think like a less interesting book could have landed on. And that sort of wills you towards it. But then I was like, well, there actually is another way to now go back and double on this and think about whether or not that's totally true, or does it encompass the whole thing? And I think with a writer who was staging an argument, you would sort of be compelled to also follow them in an argument in that way. But here it was just a different setup, which I think just like gave me more room to try to do something slightly different.
That's really interesting. I would like to note that Q&As are open, so if you have a question, like please drop it in the Q&A chat. But the question of what to quote in this book, I think is like really interesting, like from a craft standpoint, because a lot of the formal choices don't necessarily like lend themselves to huge block quotes, but I did notice that Walton's for sure had like a good amount of block quotes, which what you said about how you're trying to like tie the end together is like really insightful. But just a question about like quoting for people, like how much do you prioritize what the writer is saying versus what you're trying to say? I think that's always the question, like how much do you quote, otherwise you're just like, you know, a book report, and then how much of you actually like filtering it through your own thoughts.
And I really believe in giving a sense of the writer's voice in the review. I mean, I think I might go too far in that direction sometimes, but you know, as an author, when my books are reviewed, if they don't quote me at all, I feel like, I don't know, like review is all about them. It's not about me, you know, and I mean, I think it's really important to let the reader have a direct experience of the author's voice. So, you know, they can, I think that it does something different than just, you know, our analysis, our commentary, are this, are that. It's like, you know, anyway, I'm for it. And I don't think I've ever written a review that doesn't quote, even when I write really short. Well, the only ones are 50 words for people. Those don't quote. But even in 300-word ones for Kirkus, I always quote. I think it's like an imperative.
Yeah, I think it's imperative too. It's funny, it's a great question, because when I started reviewing quite a long time ago, I think I used to have this sort of rule that the reviews should have a quote so that people knew what the writer's voice sounded like. But I tended not to go beyond that, because I regarded it at some level as cheating, like, you know, like making the author do my work for me, the thinking work and the analysis of it. And now I've come more to Marion's side of things, where, you know, look, you still have to do the thinking part. You still have to make the connections. You still have to have the reasons for why you're quoting what you're quoting. This book was interesting because I just felt like there was so much to quote. The way her mind works is just so juicy that I felt a temptation to overquote on it. But I think, you know, the bottom line is you pick quotes that they still have to amplify what you are bringing to it, what you as the interpreter for readers, you still have to knit it together, whether that's you're quoting 5 different places or one. I can't imagine not quoting at all, but anyway, I don't think there's a magic formula anymore, which I used to think there was.
I was just looking over my shoulder to see if I have a copy of Martin Amos's essays, because I'm pretty sure he says early in the introduction there, and it's kind of stuck in my head since I read it years ago, that's all the critic has is quotation, right? Like, to defend your claim about the book. So even if you're quoting to actually push against the work and suggest that the author hasn't achieved what they had hoped, the language in the work itself can help you do that. So I try almost always to build the piece around a line or some significant quotation that has inspired my interrogation of the book itself. You know, and I don't know if I've gotten to this place yet, but I'm trying to figure out if I can possibly get to a place as a writer where my, I don't want to call it neutrality, but like there's a kind of tone of voice that one has to read the piece closely to understand whether it's a positive or negative review. I'd actually like there to be more thought than positive or negative. So I'm trying to figure out how to get to that particular place. And usually the quotation is one of those routes to find the fine line of building a critique that is also an entryway for others to possibly think along with the book, rather than the confirmation of one position or another.
Yeah, I guess it does seem like the central question in any of this is always like, did they actually say that? And there's no other way to do that with a quote. Really, like whether you are mad at the book or not, that just seemed the question. I think with this book, I found like longer quotes quite difficult, because even though I like love long sections of the book's just like very graphic in the like visual sense, with like where it's breaking and like the italics that are actually lifted from other literature and the like bolded sections in it, which I think sort of stymied me in some places, because I was kind of like, oh, there's like, I'm not actually just saying like, here's the lines that are good that you can now repeat, but there's something happening on the page that is like quite important, which is hard to reproduce. And I think in this one, I just got like very obsessed. Well, I opened it very obsessed with like very specific words that she chose. Which, yeah, when she said she didn't realize that she used thrall that often, but I was just like, that's not a word that comes up that often, and yet it reappears in this book a lot. So I think like that sort of led me down that road here. I don't know. I think I always have this dream in my head. I was just thinking about what you just said, wasn't that I will accomplish being totally cool and dispassionate. I think I've given up on that dream, and mostly I just have a lot of emotions. But I think with this one, it gave a good place where you could switch between them, in part because of the specificity of her language. So, you know, you could dump some of that emotion off on her and be like, it's just her fault, it's not me.
But then how that blends into the idea of the reader using the entering the quote as like a vessel or like a compass versus like it's a substantiation thing, like that's really great. I thought about another line from Blair's review in Book Forum, memoir is the highest form of autofiction and like an unmannerly genre, which I've never thought about memoir as unmannerly at all. But I guess compared with like, you know, there's these like extreme formalist tradition in fiction and poetry, like, yeah, like that tracks. But I just wanted to ask the group a question about like drafting reviews. We spoke like earlier in the conversation about how Blair, you'd wound up bringing in the Negroland sections and stuff like later on as you were working, but how different did your reviews wind up versus how you were sketching them out when you first wrote your drafts? And what is your like revision process like?
I don't think it wound up like shockingly different from once there was actually a draft. I think it takes me like a very long time to get to a draft, and less long from that point on. Yeah, like between 0 and 60 is a very slow process, but 60 to 100 is fine. But to be honest, it's just I don't know. The editor who is there, Mara Smith, is just a phenomenal editor.
Yes,
I would just give her a lot of credit for it. And she sort of knew where I was headed and what I was up to, and is very good at sort of pushing you in the direction that you're trying to go without letting you be totally sloppy. But I think for me, it is a question actually of that first draft, and it's mostly just a lot of walking around my house, repeating passages to myself until I have an actual sentence in my head.
Mine is a very, very short review. It's it's 500 words. And you know, when I write short reviews like that, I have a fairly strong idea of the form that I have to pour into from the start. And I don't write 3,000 words and cut it down to 500 words. I I shoot to write 500 words. So, you know, I mean, with this review, I was struggling because honestly, like I explained, I really didn't want to be disrespectful. And I didn't know if my demand for, you know, more personal info could be perceived that way. But so it was more about, you know, so I think I had some of what Blair's describing of like really taking some time to get started and find my track. But you know, then I'm very conscious when I write of how long it has to be, and I make the art, you know, I write to that length. So yeah, I think I'm sure other people would probably write a lot more and then, you know, pull out the 500 good words, but I'm just such an efficiency maniac that I have to write the 500 good words and, you know, not do it that other way. I know, you know, I was very sure that I wanted to give a sense of that internal dialogue and quote, you know, and how it's in boldface and really make a point about the reading experience. So that's, you know, I started right there. And then, you know, I was sort of, as I say, I was snooping around in the whole critical canon about Margo Jefferson. And I did find, I mean, plenty of other critics that were saying this, and about the previous books, you know, they wanted more Margo. And so it's not the first time that anyone said it. And I think it's understandable, and for many different reasons why she would make these choices. But I don't think that, to be honest, I don't think she'd have to lose much to give more on her personal experience. Anyway, that was going off topic, but yeah, no, I didn't. I don't think I rewrote a lot. I wrote it. I shaped my way through it, and then it was done.
No, that's fair. Just to digress a little bit, but because I recall Karen saying that part of the book's appeal may lie in the fact that it's like a 200-ish page book. And so it's like this two sides of the coin where she could have added more on the one hand, and it would have been, you know, given you more of what you wanted, but on the other hand, you know, it's kind of like a tour de force from like open to close. And so maybe that would have like changed the shape of its and so you know, it's hard to prove a positive, I guess, whether or not it would be better or worse. But it is an interesting question to raise, like what would have she had to given up to do that?
So it looks like here I'm looking in my file that I wrote 8 versions of the review. That just means that I, you know, sometimes I tweak the word. I do draft quite a bit, and as my mind is, you know, adjusting the piece and narrating, I'll start a new draft, so that number might be misleading in terms of the kinds of changes from version to version. But I don't think I figured out the end of the review until the 7th iteration. And I suppose, I mean, when I talk about writing criticism with my graduate students and undergraduates even, and I think this is if I'm inserting something into the craft tradition of criticism, I would say that I'm writing to actually figure out what I'm thinking, not because I know what I'm doing. So it might take those 7 drafts for me to say, oh, this is actually the story I'm trying to tell. And then I can figure out how to close the piece, because I see where the ending is. And, you know, I actually love, probably my editors don't love that overdraft, but I love overdrafting. Just to kind of be really clear with myself about what a book is doing and how I'm being affected by it.
I am also an overdrafter. Not as in terms of like the iterations of drafts, but just in terms of word count and stuff. Like, to the chagrin of my editors, like I'm probably going to overwrite and cut down versus like not write enough words. I'm talking too much because I'm excited, I guess. Because I think that especially for a book like this, like if it excites you, or even if it just like frustrates you, you're gonna wanna like try to like really like talk about it, especially if it's a writer like Margo Jefferson, who, you know, I think all of us have a great deal of respect for. But yeah, I am also like an avid overdrafter. It's better to be overdressed than underdressed, as the saying goes. But that's just me. Were there any other thoughts about like how you all draft? I'm just so curious about like people's processes, like how people approach writing.
Well,
And
I want to ask Karen if did you have an idea, a thought even of trying to produce an illustrated review, and what would that look like?
I love Karen's illustrations, by the way.
Thank you.
Fantastic illustrator.
I did not think about doing that, and it's such a great question that I feel bad that I did not think about doing that. But you know, the Times sometimes does that sort of thing, and I can see doing this. Would have been a great book to do that, I think, because it's so kinetic. And I was just looking at the cover today, at the graphic on the cover, and the fact that they like did the mirror images and the mirror words, a memoir, and like it just lends itself to extrapolation and to creative interpretation. I might still do it. I might steal your idea and try to do it just for myself, for a personal project. I have thought about doing illustrated book reviews. I haven't figured out where I would sell it, but I do a lot of illustrations. I don't sell, but it's such a great book for that, yeah, it's beautiful.
I'm reminding our guests, thank you for attending this panel, by the way, that the Q&A is open. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. We're about at the 2-minute mark before opening the floor to questions.
Can I ask a question of the panel? I'm curious, Marion mentioned a couple times being respectful and having that in your brain. And I'm wondering how much you all think about or are able to push away thoughts about the author reading your review as you're trying to write. I think while we're reading, at least my experience is I'm always imagining the writer, especially with memoir. But I'm just curious to hear more about your thoughts about that, especially when you come across something that you thought didn't work or even straight up failed. You know, how do you all handle picturing, you know, the author reading your review? And
this just happened to me with the new A.M. Holmes book. I really didn't like it, and I love the writer, and I was completely stressed out about doing this, you know. So but I did it, you know. Course, you know, and let me say again, I mean, I was a writer before I was a book reviewer, so I always think the writer's perspective and always imagine. And I can quote you lines from bad reviews of my books from 1996, you know. So yeah, so I know that it really does make, you know, that it's something, it can land really hard, you know. And I do think about it, and I try in the case of writers that I really respect, to make it absolutely clear how I feel about the writer and about their work, and, you know, how this book, you know, disappointed me for whatever reason and why. And I mean, oh, an even worse thing was with Stephanie Danler, who wrote Sweet Bitter, and I loved Sweet Bitter. And then she followed up with a memoir that, I mean, I didn't just not like it, I like hated it. And so, you know, I had to, I wrote a real, you know, I loved you, but now I hate you. So for me, those feelings are really a big part of what I do. And I, you know, I guess I feel like I have a relationship with these authors as a critic, and I want to make it be as honest and positive as I can, unless I just hate them all together. Like, you know, I had to review that guy, Dan Brown, for example. So yeah, I didn't worry about what he would feel. So
I've heard from authors twice. Once really early on, like maybe my second review. And what was interesting, both of the writers took it personally. One was a very new writer. The second was a very established writer. And just as Marion was describing, I wrote this review like, we can't talk about American literature without this person. They're so great. They've been great. However, this book isn't doing what it aims to do. And the email I got was like, well, you know, you didn't really read the book. You missed it. And I think, just to cite Marion again, like, it was one line that he had attached himself to and didn't see everything else I said, that like even a weak work had things that I was trying to be very respectful of, like, oh, I see what they were attempting to do. And we went back and forth a little bit. I'm not sure that I convinced them that I actually had great love for their previous works. But in the first case, I'm laughing because it's such a funny story. I noticed that there was a problem. There was a novel set in the mid to late 60s, south side of Chicago, about a friendship between two young African-American characters. One of them messes up and doesn't get sent off to Vietnam. I just noticed that, like, oh, that's what they would have done. Like, you have a choice. You can go to jail, you can go to war. So I brought this up because there's like there was a gap in the story. And I heard from the writer, who was unhappy that I had pointed this out. And I think he said something like, oh, you know, my mother had to see this. It actually wasn't a negative review. I quite liked much of this novel. But then the writer revealed to me that it was his agent who had sent the book off to a contest and taken a section out so it wouldn't weigh so much when it was shipped. So that section got removed. And I was like, oh, so I hadn't misread it. It was just me pointing it out that had caused a problem. So, I mean, I think that person ended up doing okay. Like, another book came out. I didn't even kill the book. So, I mean, I sometimes kind of worry about hurting someone's feelings. So I do generally err on the side of generosity, even in what might be a negative review. And I think I know enough about writing now to understand that it's always hard. And that even when it's a bad book, it's like, well, that's one more book than I've got. So, congratulations. Better luck next time.
I guess I don't know, in the like film stuff I do, I tend to try to read like the very first reviews that come out of something I've worked on, and then I'll try to find a really bad review to read, and then I kind of check out. And I guess the way I don't know that I like ever imagine the author of something or whoever the creator is of something that I'm doing, because I think kind of anybody who reads you that closely is probably going to hurt your feelings, probably on accident. And not because it's like you're necessarily out to get them. I just think most people can't bear close scrutiny. And so I don't think there's ever like a thought in my head that I'm like, oh, how will they feel when they see this? Because I'm sure that probably whatever I think would be the thing that would hurt them, it'll be a line like sort of like what somebody just said, it'll be line 4 parts down where I was like, oh, I actually thought that was cool. I think instead, I mean, I guess I'm conscious in certain things of like what that person's position in the world might be. You said the Dan Brown thing. It's like if somebody's just a monolith and they exist everywhere, then I'm like, well, like, you're fine. Whatever happens. Whereas, I think I would probably be more reticent to be like, I am going to pan this like first poetry book. Well, that seems not nice. I think I'm more likely, honestly, if that were the stakes, to be like, I'm just going to pass on this question. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think I try not to think heavily about them, but mostly because I'm like, I'm certain that the way I hurt you will not be the way I thought I was going to hurt you.
Well, what you're saying, I mean, as an author, I love feeling that I've been closely scrutinized. I mean, that's what I want. I, want to feel like the person, even no matter, because so often that's not what you feel. You feel like the person is reacting to some, I don't know, something that they made up in their head of what your book is that isn't, so close. It's like the fact of someone actually encountering, the language and the book is what I think an author wants. And that's what I wanted to say. Like when I write a negative review, I really make sure to give the evidence, like say, why am I saying this? I don't want it to be, never would want it to be a character assassination or some kind of vague, thing. Like if you're going to take someone down, I think you have to give the close reading. And as an author, I would be much more able to bear that kind of negative review than, who the hell does Marion Minnick think she is? Like bullshit. So yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I was talking to somebody recently because something I had worked on had got a negative review, and somebody was like very worried that I would be hurt by this. And I was like, well, no, because they took it seriously. Like, that's actually the only question I have here. Like, are you going to take it as seriously as the years people put into it? And that, I think, like, that's just the game. Like, if that to me is fine. I agree with you. It's not like the who do you think you are thing is irritating. But like, I will take this seriously and it's not adding up. I'm like, well, unfortunately, that's the game we all signed up for.
Yeah, I love that. The job of the critic, or at least like a large portion of it, is like to take the work seriously. And that is a sign of respect versus like a sign of, disrespect. We do have a few questions in the chat that I want to kick over to Dan so that he can ask them.
Hi, am I here? Can everybody see me?
Yep, you're here.
Yeah.
Awesome. Appearing out of nowhere. Well, thanks. First of all, let me just say to everyone, this is awesome. I'm so just happy and honored to hear all of you talking about your reviews and everything. This is really great. And also so helpful to me in writing. But anyway, I've been reviewing some of the questions that are coming. A few of them I think have been answered, but some of them, and we have some in the chat too. But I could just start with one from the Q&A here, which is like, so it's kind of about the outlets that you publish in, and I'll just kind of read some of it out here. And it says, how much is the changing landscape of publishing and of publishing outlets altering what and how much you review? And then the question goes on to note that all of the reviews of this book were in major paper outlets, but that opportunities there are diminishing. So like, I guess this is a big picture question about kind of your reviewing practice in general. and how you see the kinds of opportunities to write and what you can write and the kinds of things you can review. And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that.
I mean, I think it's a huge change. When I was book review editor at the Plain Dealer in Cleveland back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and a lot of newspapers still had book sections. I had a book section that in some cases was 3 or 4 pages. When I started that job, it got smaller over the 5 years that I was doing it, and now it's and they were all either me writing reviews or hiring freelance. It was not Wire. Now that space is diminished to less than a page in the art section, and it's Wire. So there's it's the newspaper does really no independent book reviewing at all in there. It's really rough to think of it as the mainstay of a freelance career, because you just it's very hard to count on, and it for some reason, in terms of newspapers anyway, it's a thing that editors who need to save money in their budgets, they think it's easy. Oh, we'll just cut out this freelance, and it is a sad thing. So it's been dramatic, and I think bad for, honestly, not to be overly dramatic, but I think it's bad for the country. I think it's and bad for local booksellers and local authors, and yeah.
But I just wanted to mention that, so when I do books on my podcast, which is I just recommend 2 books a week in 4 minutes, and I very often go to bookmarks in LitHub and see all the, it turns out, it's not just as small as it seems. I mean, sometimes a book will have like 15 reviews and bookmarks, and a lot of them are fairly small online venues, and a lot of those ones that people can write at at length and have, and I just want to recommend that bookmarks, because it can really be encouraging to see that so many different people are speaking up, and and it's I agree, Karen. I mean, and I know it is dire, and as a freelancer, it's almost a joke to try to even make half your income from book reviewing, forget all, but I feel like that there are enough quirky, different online venues and places around the country and regional that there are a wide variety of voices are being heard. And that's a great way to hear them if you haven't seen that section.
I would add too, just very briefly, because I want to hear like other people's thoughts on it, is that like I don't know what it was like in the before times, because I really only started doing this seriously like a handful of years ago. But I am very hardened by the sense of community that like freelance critics have. So, like at the NBCC specifically, there is a freelance guide and like a database of all the different reviewers and like email addresses, things of that nature, and the willingness for people to share contact, etc. Like it is hard, like it is like really bad, like 50%. I'll be lucky if I clear like 5 or like 10% of my income like from reviewing. Like the math just doesn't add up for me, but I am very hardened by the community of reviewers and like how willing people are to help each other out, and also acknowledge the inequities of the space.
Yeah, I mean, my like boring direct answer is also just like, it's not like my day job. The job that like actually pays for my life is in film. This does not pay for my life in any way. I don't know. I mean, in terms of like, I think sort of the second half of that question of like what and how much you review. Yeah, there probably is a different world where it was as sustainable as it was a while ago, and then maybe I review more. I don't know if it shifts what as much. I think I've somewhat insulated myself from the what pressure. Or maybe it's just that the editors who talk to me most frequently know what I will do. So maybe it's actually just being funneled before it even gets to me. It probably is. It probably has nothing to do with me.
I just wish that there were more outlets generally with more space. So I think Marion is writing the full range from 50 words to 500 or more. And you know, I don't know who the angel investor is who's going to do this, but we probably need outside of the major newspapers, more like kind of regional magazines, the kind of, I love Book Forum, as, in terms of its shape and its form, like, the other kind of, I guess you'd call them long sheet magazines like London Review or the New York Review. But probably we need like 2 or 3 more magazines like that, where there's, space for all the different kinds of writing and thinking that's going on in terms of literary criticism specifically, but of course, literary critics can write about anything. And it is as there seem to be more and more writers trying to get into fewer and fewer places. Whether it's online or in print kind of doesn't matter to me, but probably to make it sustainable, that people have to get paid. And that's where the Silicon Valley money will come in handy. But I agree with Karen that when there's a thriving critical culture, I actually think that we, as a kind of national group, speak and think about each other, speak to and think about each other differently than we do now. And I can see in my own kind of 22, well, I'll go back further than that, been teaching since the mid 1990s. And I can just see the difference in a less literate culture. We're consuming a lot of stuff, but we're not as literate as we were in other moments. And I think that also has to do with the kind of critical culture, when you could, whether it was something even like the Village Voice. I still remember one day getting that when I was in graduate school in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the record store where I worked, they would come in on Thursdays from the previous week, and you could flip to the back and start reading reviews from Greg Tate and Stanley Crouch, may they rest in peace, and Gary Giddens, any number of really great established writers who were writing about music or books or film in deep and serious ways. And I thought that was like my education outside of the classroom. And I felt like I was participating in a thing just from reading those reviews and thinking about the ideas. I was participating in something that was larger than myself. And I think that's actually still what's exciting to me about criticism, is that I want to hear literally what my neighbors are thinking about deeply, and be driven to things that I hadn't thought about taking up. So with that kind of shrinking space, we're losing quite a bit. I don't know how to solve that. I was just participating in a conversation a couple weeks ago in Massachusetts with some poetry critics about this very problem. And, you know, we might be at our wit's end short of creating our own organization, but, you know, who has the time or the money for that? And then, you know, finding the writers would be the easy part, I think. But I think this is like the consistent question and the consistent, you know, people shrugging their shoulders because there aren't necessarily answers for the problem.
That's where the angel investor comes in, maybe. What can we, there's another, let's see, for Q&A, I'm just kind of looking at the chat. Maybe there's like 1 or 2 questions that are posted in chat. I think you all can see them too, but I don't know. One of them seems particularly interesting to me where it's like, so we can think of reviews as snapshots, right? Photos of sorts or a critic's engagement with a book at particular points in time. So for everyone, do you ever return to reviews you've written in the past and have a desire to update where you came down critically, simply because you've changed personally or because the world has? That's an interesting question. I feel like the kind of like the temporal identity, you know, of reviews. And I don't know whether that ever is something that is part of you're thinking about them as you look back on them.
Well, we rarely get the opportunity to write about books that are not, you know, brand new, which is, you know, except in some of the like the TLS and stuff. But, you know, I definitely feel this. And I would love to read more reviews where critics talked about their changing opinion of a book over time. And but this is definitely a problem with, you know, the way criticism is structured, and it's frustrating. One of the reasons that I started having my podcast is just so that I could have the freedom to talk about books that aren't coming out this week or next week, or, you know, and I think more people should use Substack and blogs and podcasts and stuff to just, you know, put your opinion out there and have the opportunity to talk about books that aren't so in the publicity cycle. It's amazing that anyone read anything besides Matthew Perry's memoir, you know, 2 weeks ago, since every single media in the entire world was about it, you know, and it was really a profoundly terrible book. But anyway, just cut, in case you haven't read it yet, I really don't recommend that you do. But yeah, the publicity cycle is annoying and limiting for criticism. And I think that it would be that I wish everyone would find ways around it so that we don't only have to talk about, you know, the fresh lettuce.
Could I follow up with that briefly and ask, like, how much do you feel like social media has impacted that? Or do you feel like it's just exactly what we were talking about previously, which is these, I guess the decline of, if there's less space, right? Like you're reliant more on the news cycle kind of thing, or do you feel like it's like a social media impacted thing?
I think it's the legacy media. I mean, they don't need social media to tell them this. This is how they all think. You know, the publicists send out the cycle of book criticism is completely tied to the publicity cycle for books, and it's very rigid. You know, sometimes a book could have been out, you know, 2 weeks, and you forget trying to pitch, you know, I mean, everybody knows if you want to pitch books, you have to pitch them months before they come out. Once, you know, say a book comes out, you haven't already realized that you wanted to review this book, too bad, you know, unless, as I say, you develop your own arena to talk about things, because everywhere, well, maybe I don't know about Book Forum, and because I write for more commercial places. So maybe some of these others do let you do older books, but I haven't seen a lot of venues where books can be reviewed after the bloom is off the rose.
It's such a good idea.
No, go ahead, please.
I mean, the question is so great because we do change. We are different readers over time. And we have all, I assume, had the experience of going back and rereading a book, just rereading a book from a long time ago, and understanding how different it is. It's just such a rich idea to then write about it. And you know, it's not like the public's appetite for learning about books is not restricted to just what's coming out. It's just not, you know, I mean, that's not the way we work with cultural stuff. We want to know what's good and interesting, and I don't know, it's just.
Yeah, I think that's right. I just had a piece run last week on Teju Cole's most recent essay collection that came out actually a year ago. And
Very good, by the way.
Thanks, I appreciate
Recommendation.
that. I think actually it's coming out right at the right time. Even though I wrote it some months ago, it just kind of took a minute for it to find the right launch point in their schedule at the Nation. But I think it's the temperature in the country is just right for that piece, because what I try to do there is think about the thing that we've just experienced that we've actually not dealt with, which is the pandemic, where globally 6 million people died. And what Cole is asking us to do in that book doesn't just matter in November of 2021, right? It has this long resonance. And so and maybe that's what I was trying to say earlier about, the kind of long sheet magazines, is that a considered take on a book that's come out even in the last 24 months is still frankly timely. Like the idea that we have to get it the day that it comes out, otherwise it's not worthy of coverage, seems ridiculous. But I think it speaks to the fact that everyone is trying to get the same set of eyeballs, ostensibly. I think that's also a mistake of the legacy kind of media. But yeah, I mean, to catch all the stuff that's coming out, I'm sitting in my office on campus right now, and I'm looking at 2 shelves of books from the last probably 7 years. From, I came on the board in spring of 2014. There are books that I got that I could maybe read the first like 4 or 5 pages. And now in 2022, I'm like, oh, I do finally have time to read that book on New Orleans. Okay, let me go read that now. That seems only old in, our weird sense of time. It's still going to be a new and rich read. And going back to like books that I have read, I have the luxury of teaching books that I have reviewed. And so I'm rereading them over and over and over again and discovering stuff that I actually missed. I'm right now rereading Swing Time. And there are whole swaths of it that I was like, oh, this is brilliant. Why didn't I write about this? I forgot about this part. So I'm with all of you on that. Like, more time, nothing is old.
Yeah, I guess the thing I always think about with books, because I read about film a fair amount too. And film just always has an out, which is repertory theaters, and so old things are getting screened again quite constantly. Not constantly. Every film programmer just shook their head at me, but in a way that isn't true of books. That it's like it's easier to find a new cycle again for something. There's like a Taiwanese new wave series going on right now here in New York. And all of those movies are like 80s and early 90s that have been around for a while and people have been thinking about for, now 3 decades. But but it's easy to pin that to like, well, now here's another reason why I think we should talk about this again. Which is just like a really fortunate thing for that entire medium, that there's always some excuse I think you can think up for like, yeah, okay, so it took me 10 years, but like now is a good time. Which is, I think, much harder with books, except in some of those places that will let you take a bit longer. I don't really have like a great suggestion for how do you do repertory screenings for books. But I think, you know, the thing you just said is right. Like a year seems like a totally reasonable amount of time to take to write about a book. I mean, it seems like a fast time to write a book, so I don't know why it would be like that much faster to think about the book.
I think we have time for one more question. I think this one is actually pretty good in the Q&A. Do critics and review venues respond differently to books sent by publishers than to books sent to them by the authors? I think that's really like a question about the publishers cycle, right? Because we were talking about the ecosystem a bit, but it's how that we've not talked about was how there's like PR departments and like publicists. So editors might send you books, publishers might send you books. Editors, if you're lucky, like that's really fortunate. Normally I'm like hustling, but I do get a handful. But usually there's oftentimes like a ton of like publicists and people in like sales departments, that type of thing, sending you books that on top of all the other books. So is there a way that we approach that differently, or do you just treat everything the same, like interested, not interested? I think that's a good question, like just in terms of being cognizant of the publishing ecosystem. Like, how do you take what you want to review seriously, I guess, is the broader question.
I don't think I treat the path differently. I mean, I guess like I tend to discount jacket copy like out of hand, so which I think is why I don't take them differently. Because if a publicist sends it to me and it's like, you know, the 12 coolest people are saying it's the coolest book of all time, like I just don't really think that hard about it. So no, I mean, obviously sometimes it's like I know who the person is, or I might know their work or something, and that might have something to do with it. But mostly it's just come down to like, does it seem interesting? I'll open it, I'll look through it for a bit. Which is like, I do really like the thing about like the right time, because I'm always telling people that like, I do think there are certain times you can read books, and like even certain times of the year you can read books. Like every August I read an 800-page novel, and I think you can't really do that outside of August for some reason. So I think some of it is just like, it's about timing and what it seems to be speaking to, and maybe it's jogging something else I've already been thinking about or want to think about, but I don't think it has that much to do with like the path it came through, because most of the paths they might come through are, and like the path that is most likely to get me to do something is somebody whose taste I respect says, I think you'd like this.
Yeah, agreed. I don't know if there's any other thoughts on that.
I would just add to, I agree with that, and I would just add that certain publicists who've been doing book publicity for a long time and have proven themselves really trustworthy, you know, when they say, those people say, this is an interesting book, I think you'd like it, or I'm really urging, I will listen to those people. You know, you're right, there's a ton of publicists out there and they're trying to sell things. Excuse me. But one of the nice things is to develop relationships with those people in the industry who love books too, and who have taste. So sorry.
I really like those, and most anticipated books, first half of 2023, that like Vulture and The Millions and some of the other places do. I find, where they have gone out there and gone through the catalogs and pulled together, I think I find that like somebody's doing part of my job for me, because really, I should look through all these publishers' catalogs and but it's so, I love the most anticipated lists and look through them. And that's one of the main ways I get my ideas about what I could pitch, because we have to know months in advance, as I'm saying now. So, that's like right now, I've been looking for the lists to come out for next year, and there hasn't really been much yet. But I'm sure we'll be hearing soon everything we can't wait to read in 2023 or whatever year it's about to be.
Today, so they're on the way. I guess I feel the same way about the publicist, and I guess I've been doing this long enough that I also know something about what my interests are, which change and vary. Although I might have to borrow Blair's idea about August as the month for, reading, something like Mason-Dixon, which I haven't tried to read.
Mason and Dixon is the one I just did this August.
Okay.
Really?
Okay. I'm pinching. If you're out there listening, I'm coming for you. But also because I know something about the kinds of things I want to think about, I'm also looking for those books. One of the great things about being on the board is that I felt like I did 2 more master's degrees, especially when I was on the nonfiction committee, which and nonfiction and criticism, frankly. Those 2 committees, I felt like I was getting more and more education, and I kind of love that concept. So I'm constantly looking for those books that are going to teach me about things that I am interested in, but don't actually know anything about. So, the publicists who have been watching what I have been writing about and pitch me things that are in my wheelhouse, but I don't know anything about, I love that.
Yeah, that's great. I do find that about publicists very useful, in that oftentimes I'm getting a book, if nothing else, in front of me that I wouldn't have thought to look at because it might not be on the vulture list, let's say, which I also do love and contribute to a little bit. Yeah, this was really great. Thank you all for being here and agreeing to talk through Margo Jefferson's book and your process of reviewing generally. Just to introduce our panelists, and so you can all go do a crash read on them. Walter Mayumba, Blair McClendon, Karen Sandstrom, and Marianne Winnick. And thanks again to Dan for helping put this together. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.